Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 3 of Philippians. We hope that your groups are going well and that you're enjoying this series so far. Today, I am joined by Evan Renfroe. And so Evan is our online creative associate and helps with all things technical and visual and whatever else. And I just want to say up front, I envy your hair.
Oh, thank you.
Like, I wish I had that hair. All my hair is falling out. It's going on vacation. And so far, my hair's not coming back. So
I can't grow any facial hair, so luckily I
have
the head
well,
hair.
it's still working out on top for you.
Yeah.
So anyway, thought that would be a good awkward place to start the
Fantastic.
conversation today. Yeah. So in week 3 of Philippians, we talk about conflict and how conflict is kind of a natural part of human relationships. Talk to us about like your view on conflict among believers, because sometimes I think people think that, oh, if we're all believers and we all love Jesus, then we're just always going to get along. Why do you think it's kind of jarring whenever believers find themselves in conflict with each other?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think conflict allows us to kind of get to that place of depth of work and allows relationships to actually progress and move forward, in that nothing's kind of reserved or left unaddressed, in the sense of like, if there's an issue, if there's a problem, it is kind of brought to the surface, it is discussed, we're able to move past it or move through it together. And I think a lot of times it's kind of avoided because it is uncomfortable. It is a vulnerable place to be, kind of just airing out maybe your issues or maybe differences of opinion, whatever it may be. But yeah, I think it allows us to actually move forward in growth, and it strengthens a relationship, I believe, because you go through that maturation process together.
Yeah. Yeah. So, in part of your background is, I mean, everybody's going to assume this is my background, but like working out and fitness and all that kind of, I'm sure there are better words
been a while,
for it, right?
but
yeah. All right. So my understanding is that whenever, and clearly I don't employ this a lot, but let's just say for the sake of illustration, that the tearing of the muscle actually serves to build it, correct?
Right. There's a level of, it's has to meet the demand that is newly imposed. So in the sense of something beyond just maintenance or beyond what is allowing stagnation, you have to adapt to that new demand. So you're breaking it down so that it can come back stronger, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of like that. I mean, obviously it's a loose correlation. I'm not trying to do apples to apples, but whenever believers find themselves in conflict and it feels like there's a little bit of a tearing apart, if as believers we work through it and we have good dialogue about it, then I think it ultimately begins to help us a lot more in the long run, because then we're stronger in our faith, we're stronger in our relationship with the person that we had that conflict with. I know that people that I've had conflict with in the faith, on the other side of it, I feel like I know them better, they know me better, we appreciate each other's perspective more. And so maybe in your groups, that's one of the things that you could talk about. I'm not really inciting you toward conflict in your group, but there may be things that need to be said. There may be conversations privately that you need to have with somebody. Say, hey, I just want to make sure you understand, like, I disagree with that, or that created some conflict in my spirit. But to have the courage to bring that up. But I think the important thing is that we do it in a healthy way. And I think if, for me, you can give me your opinion in just a minute. But for me, if my objective in going to somebody and talking about something that feels a little conflict oriented, in the flesh, my goal is to win. And I'm not sure that that's the spirit of Christ. What's your opinion on that?
No, I absolutely wrestle with. I think pride for me is something that I have to keep in check and continue to yield to the Spirit in that, because winning the argument in a lot of ways is kind of like the aim when it's led by pride. But I think bringing up the good point of it being necessary, I think, for the health and the longevity of that relationship. Like if there's something that is kind of bothering you, it would, in most cases, if you value the relationship enough, or if you value that friendship enough, it's worth addressing and worth discussing with a level of humility and vulnerability that you're going to be in that place of discomfort, and you have to, again, kind of like yield to the Spirit and let that pride be suppressed enough that you're looking for, how can I understand this person, or how can I listen to them in a way that's like actually taking into consideration what did upset them, or what did maybe they disagreed with, or whatever it may be. But for me personally, I have to kind of set the pride down and actually listen sometimes.
Yeah, that's a challenge for all of us, and maybe that's another thing people could talk about in their groups is kind of whenever you feel yourself moving into conflict, one, What is it that causes you not to want to enter that conversation? Because I think that's a big thing to talk about. But equally, it's important to talk about for those people who are always looking for an argument, always looking for conflict. What is in you, in the flesh, that unhealthy part of you that's driving you toward that? Because if it's just to win, if it's your pride or whatever else, then that's something that needs to be, kind of mined out through the power of the Spirit. I love the text that we went over this week in the message, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. And I like what you said, because you cannot be of the same mind and one accord if you're not listening to what the other person has to say or what the other institution. There are people who get mad at churches because of one thing they heard, and instead of talking about it and trying to say maybe their perspective was wrong or maybe the church's perspective wasn't communicated clearly or whatever else, you just kind of dig your heels in and abandon the whole thing. But Paul seems to be telling us, listen, it brings about joy in the lives of believers when we are of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. And then he says, this is that pride thing, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility, you got to count others more significant than yourself. So not looking only to your own interests, but to the interests of others. And then he goes to give us the greatest example of that, which was Jesus. Here's Jesus, who decided, I'm going to resist the urge, although I am completely God. I'm not going to necessarily leverage that in my humanity so that I can demonstrate what it looks like to be at peace, to take on the form of a servant, to not look to just get my way, but to exemplify what it would look like for a Christ follower to live in a broken world. So what are, and this is a really broad question. I certainly don't expect that this is an answer necessarily that, we could defend, but just in your gut, what are some of the things that you feel like bring about conflict, maybe in a group setting between people, or whether it's in a CG or in a church setting or whatever? Like, what does that selfish ambition look like, or how does conflict kind of manifest itself?
Sure. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, we're always kind of looking at things from our perspective, from our life experiences, from our views. And I think, again, when pride kind of comes to the forefront of that, we always feel ours is right. So, we're in a pretty heated season as it is. So I will say too that I think we find it difficult to actually have conversations where we're listening to the other person's perspective and their point of view and trying to hear where they're coming from with that experience. But in a lot of ways, we just have the assumption that we're right. And I know, again, that's kind of a broad answer to a broad question, but if we always believe that our perspective is the right perspective, we've almost kind of closed ourselves off to whatever we may be able to learn or discover from good dialogue around these things. But
yeah, and it does feel like a lot of our culture has just decided that learning is sort of taboo at this point. That whatever your opinion is, whatever you read on Facebook, whatever article or the smartest person said or whatever, that must then be gospel truth. And anyone who disagrees with you is now the enemy, or is somebody that you have to go to battle with. And I think, one of the things that I feel like has become sort of paramount in this season that we've gone through as a country is there are issues that I think are negotiable in the lives of believers, and then there are issues that we should hold as non-negotiable. And we need to work to find agreement, or to try to persuade people to understand what we believe Scripture teaches about the non-negotiables. But maybe Christians along the way have stopped being able to discern properly what is something that adults can agree to disagree on, and not let it birth conflict, but instead to say, you know what, that's not a pillar of my faith. That's not part of the foundation upon which my faith is built. So we can disagree on that, but there are other things that if there's disagreement that we feel really compelled at that point to say, okay, I'm going to do whatever I can to graciously speak truth in love to try to win them over to my way of thinking. So not really a question in there, but any thoughts on that?
A pastor we had when we lived in Tennessee would always kind of refer to, there's things that are maybe doctrine related, but they're close-fisted, they're tightly held, they are the foundation of our beliefs, and then they're more open-handed topics that you could, like you said, you could reach the point of disagreement and it doesn't affect or impact the relationship or even how you value the person. So I love that reminder. We could all use that reminder, but I think that's a great place to look.
Yeah, and so again, I think the most powerful part of this portion of the text is have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus. So this is like expected of Christians, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but instead emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And that doesn't mean that when we do that, we're going to remove ourselves from all conflict. Jesus wound up being crucified, right? And so there's still the potential for conflict, but we have an opportunity, even in the midst of some of that more tense conversation or some of those bigger disagreements or whatever, to take on the form of a servant, which I think you've touched on that we would be humble, that we would be willing to listen and learn. One of the things that we've tried to employ in our family, and I tell couples this all the time, you want to get rid of a large portion of conflict, you've got to learn to, number one, listen, and then whenever you're listening and the check engine light and your spirit goes off because they said something that you're like, oh, that made me feel terrible. You know what I'm talking about. The check engine light? Okay, we all got it. So when the check engine light goes off in your spirit, like in our house, what we try to do is go, okay, now it's my responsibility as a follower of Jesus to at least make sure I understood correctly. Because if I just respond to what I'm feeling, there's a chance that that's not what they intended to communicate. So what we do in our house is we say, okay, before we go any further, I just want to clarify what I heard you say or what I understood you to say was, and then we just say it the way we feel it. And almost every single time we do that, the other person's like, no, that is not at all what I intended to communicate. So a big part of conflict resolution is to just be humble and say, I may have misunderstood. I may not really be tracking with you. And as a result of that, I want to be sure that I can get some clarity. But anyway, you get the final closing thought.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great thing to employ. I think in a lot of ways too, it's a reflection. If we have a resistance towards something, it says more about how we feel. And sometimes maybe it is, I love the analogy of the check engine light, but maybe it is an opportunity for us to work on something in our own heart and in ourselves. It may have just been prompted by someone else, but it could be that conviction of, the spirit within us that has an area of opportunity for us to evaluate and grow and move forward. I think that's a great practice, kind of just that self-reflection, yield to the Spirit. Like if there's any area that I need to work on, if there's any area that needs growth, and in such a way that's approached with humility, knowing that what's on the other side is worth kind of going through that discomfort.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's a great reminder and a great place to search.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you dialoguing with me. And for all of you who are in groups watching this, we hope that your conversation is fruitful as you deal with the issue of conflict, how to deal with that biblically, and how to emulate and do our very, very best to be more Christ-like as we continue to interact with people, find places of disagreement, that we would come to a place of mercy and ultimately of agreement. That would be the goal.